Our next presenter is Laura Madokoro from the Department of History at Carleton University. Laura is an award-winning historian whose work explores the history of migration, refugee and humanitarianism with a particular focus on the history of race and exclusion among the white settler societies. Bridging the fields of social and political history, her research reflects upon the entangled past that has shaped both the local communities and global phenomena, while her public outreach highlights the dynamic connections between archives, narratives, and the historical craft.
Bonjour, mon nom est Laura Madokoro et je suis historienne et professeure agrégée dans le département d'histoire à l'Université Carleton. Carleton University is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about my work as a historian. I work specifically on the history of migration, refugees, and humanitarianism. And for the past number of years, I've been giving a lot of thought to histories of race and exclusion, particularly among white settler societies. And so that work culminated in a couple of publications, one of which was Elusive Refuge, Chinese Migrants in the Cold War, and the other Dominion of Race, Rethinking Canada's International History, which I co-edited with Francine McKenzie and Dave Marin. And so that work made me think a lot about how refugees have been received historically. And one of the key findings from that research was how important civil society activism has been in affecting change. My research has shifted focus and is largely concentrated on histories of sanctuary. And when I talk about sanctuary, I think about sanctuary in really broad terms. So moving beyond conventional definitions of sanctuary cities or religious sanctuary to think about when civil society has advocated for the protection of various folks, whether they be homeless people in need of shelter, fugitives from the law, or more recently, refugees and undocumented migrants. For the past few years, I've been involved in a project called Sites of Sanctuary, and this has been a really interesting and an exciting project where I've had the good fortune of working with a number of excellent student researchers. And what we have done is combed digitized historical newspapers for references to sanctuary. And what we've tried to do is map what we found in the newspapers, and you can see it on the slide here. What it shows is the historic instances where sanctuary has been offered. So not just in churches, but often in communities. One of the things that we uncovered looking at the newspapers and also engaging with local community archives was understanding that sanctuary has been very quiet, and so it hasn't always been made public. That's a very late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon. And so this again has prompted both an interest and offered a challenge to think about how do we write the history of sanctuaries? How do we research the history of sanctuary when it hasn't always been very public? Building on the Sites of Sanctuary research, I am now going to pursue the history of sanctuary in a couple of different ways. One is to look at the history of racialized communities and racialized individuals and the manner in which they have sought and received protection or been denied protection. And one example of this, for instance, might be the case of Weldon Chan in 1958, who came to Canada on a tourist visa from Hong Kong and overstayed and was ordered deported. And he was protected by the Chinese community in Vancouver and Toronto. He was in hiding for over 3 years, and his story was used to challenge the federal government to reform the immigration laws, which up until that point continued to be exclusionary and race-based. So the history of racialized communities often is depicted as marginal in some sense, but I think if we think about the history of sanctuary as various communities have engaged with questions of protection and hospitality, we can actually see how so-called marginalized communities are in fact very much part of the fabric of modern-day humanitarianism and protection. So that's one really important thread in the ongoing sanctuary research that I want to pursue. The other one is incredibly complicated because it involves asking questions about whose land, whose territory is being used when people offer protection. There have been some really important discussions in recent years among humanitarian workers about the work that they do and the fact that it happens on unceded, contested, unsurrendered Indigenous lands. And so for me as a historian, I think one of the things I can do is ask questions about refuge historically, about how notions of refugeehood and hospitality were employed before there was a Canadian state. So thinking about how First Nations have a long history of thinking about these issues. And then more recently, thinking about how the relationship between First Nations and the federal government also means thinking about questions of sanctuary, moral authority, and sovereignty. In the 1970s, for instance, we had members of the American Indian movement moving from the United States to British Columbia to seek protection. And this was done out of a sense of responsibility, out of a sense of community. But I think it also has a lot to do with questions of sovereignty and authority. And so I think that looking at sanctuary in the context of ongoing First Nations and federal government relations and Canadian society more broadly is going to help us understand just what is at stake when we talk about protection and refuge. One of the other things I want to do is help ground discussions of sanctuary in really specific ways. And so I am currently at work on a history of sanctuary in Montreal specifically. And what this project will do is take some of the case studies from the Sites of Sanctuary project, is going to take long histories of Indigenous mobility to think about questions of refuge and protection. Et vraiment, je veux remercier tout le monde pour cette opportunité et j'ai très hâte aux possibilités de travailler ensemble.